And that's what I want to do this morning. And I want to take us back not just 140 years, but a lot further than that. I want to take us back 2,500 years into this little book of the scriptures called Esther. And Esther is one of those books that is short. You can read it this afternoon between, making the coffee and the coffee going cold. Well, not quite, but certainly within the time it would take to drink the coffee. And it's digging into God's involvement in the world 2,500 years ago. So these are deep, deep roots. And again, are people that were under threat, are people that were confused, are people that were tired and distressed and needed God's help. And so we're going back to something which is a long way back, but which taps into very real feelings and very real emotions and very real situations, different, but similar to our situation today. And the neat thing about Esther is that Esther ends with a celebration. It's actually a story of 10 feasts, 10 chapters, 10 feasts, but it ends with a massive celebration, which is still celebrated today. And that is the Jewish feast of Purim. And that feast is the biggest, the longest, the most celebratory, party eating time, because it records and it remembers, even 2,500 years later, that God is a God of rescue, that God is a God of redemption, that God does not forget God's people, and God is nevertheless at work. And so as we look back, we can say, oh, this is God with a people in a really difficult time. That's true. But it's also remembering that God brings them through that, and that brings enormous celebration. So when we're in the midst of a difficult time, we can be reminded there will yet be spaces to celebrate. This is the book set in the empire of Persia, and King Xerxes was king, and it was the biggest empire of the time, and it spread across 127 provinces. In today's language, it would include Northwest India, Pakistan, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Israel, northern Greece, northern Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, and northern Sudan. I just want to suggest that's a reasonably big area. And it was the biggest empire. It was a very powerful empire. And the king who sat on the top of that was like a lot of kings, I guess, or powerful people, in that he was interested in partying and interested in celebrating, and kind of left the real work of the government and the time to this guy. And his name is Heyman. He's the bad guy. And you may have picked up a little bit about, well, you'll pick up a little bit more about him next week, I think. So I won't try not to go into that too much. But he was an Agite. In chapter 9 and verse 24, you'll see that he was one of this people group called the Agites. And the Agites hated the Jewish community, the people of God. And this guy, Mordecai, was Jewish. And he was a lowly official. It's him that I want to talk about this morning, a lowly official in the empire of Persia, and he sat at the gate of the city, kind of like a customs clerk or a tax person, I guess. And as a Jew who worshipped God, he refused to bow to this guy when he walked past. It really got under this guy's skin. He hated it. And he decided not only to kill Mordecai, as you would do if somebody would refuse to bow to you. I do that at work. If Kelly doesn't bow when I enter the room, I think about murder. But he didn't just want to murder one person. He wanted to wipe out the whole community of Mordecai's people. And so he kind of rigged a deal with the king, who wasn't taking too much notice of what was going on. And a edict went out across the whole of this massive empire, telling the people on a particular day, a day that was drawn by lot. That's where we get the name Purim, the drawing of lot. A date that was chosen 11 months ahead, when everyone was to rise up across the whole empire and to exterminate and kill the Jews in their community. It was going to be a genocide. Now, that ain't great news. It's terrible, terrible news. And of course, Mordecai had to respond to that. Queen Esther, you heard about a little bit more last week, and she'll pop up this week. But this is the central character that we're going to focus on today. And the key question that the book of Esther takes us to is, who is in control? And God is never mentioned explicitly in the whole book. God is kind of behind the scenes, but never named. And we are in a situation where every day we see Ashley and we see Jacinda, but we could well be asking, where's God in the midst of the situation that we're in? And no doubt that was the question that Mordecai and his people were asking. Where is God when all of this is happening? It seems like God's nowhere. And everything is about feasting and celebrating for those in power, but we are about to be exterminated and nobody seems to care. That's the context. And so I want to take you to one passage today, one little incident. I'll put this down here, sorry. In chapter 4, and if you want to read the whole thing, it's verses 1 to 17, but I'm just going to draw out two little clips. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, so what happened was that Mordecai came to the gate of Queen Esther, the palace of the king, and he heard about this edict, and he'd torn off his clothes, he'd covered himself in sack and ashcloth, and he'd gone to the edge of the gate. He wasn't allowed in wearing that kind of outfit, and he had kind of got news to the queen that this is going to happen. There's going to be a terrible occurrence for the Jewish people. She sent back this answer. Do not think that because, he sent back this answer. And what Queen Esther had done was she'd said, oh, well, I'll send him some clothes so he can get dressed. He can tidy himself up, get over it, mate. But she didn't know what was really going on. She was in the luxury of the palace and didn't know about the edict. Sometimes we can live in luxurious situations that mean we really aren't in touch with the needs of others. And she was like that. And so Mordecai sent back this answer to Queen Esther. Do not think, but because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. I guess Mike probably quoted that verse last week. But I want to pick up three things here in Mordecai. Mordecai was under real pressure. He was hated. His people were about to be wiped out. And he starts to weep and to wail and to cry out to help from God and from someone in influence in his family, Esther. He goes to God and he goes to his family asking for help. And he tells Queen Esther this three things that I think are still pertinent for us today. The first one is this: do not think that because you are, you alone will escape. We can't think that we're exempt from what's happening in the world because we're in a little country at the bottom of the world, because we're in a particular suburb in Auckland, because we're got whatever on our side, because we're younger, because we're more healthy, whatever it might be. We can't assume that we will escape. This is about us all, and we're all in this. And yes, Esther, you're in a palace and you're surrounded by guards and gates and you think you're protected, but don't elude yourself that you're not part of what's happening in the world and equally involved in the world's suffering and pain. And secondly, he says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. What he's saying is, God will do God's work. God will achieve the relief, the redemption of his people, with you or without you. Esther, you're invited to be involved. Esther, you can be part, co-creating with God and what God is doing. But if you don't think that God's going to stop. God will find a plan B, another way, another person to work with who's willing. I want to work with you, Esther. But if you say no, don't think that God's thwarted. God will find another way. It's a way to say to all of us, hey, God doesn't need you. God can do it without Alan, without you. But God wants to do it with us. God wants us to be part of what God is doing in the world, redeeming and rescuing and caring, and invites us to be part of it. But will do it with us or without us. Why not be part of it? And the third thing that's here is the last piece. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows that God has woven you into a particular role, skill set, experience, amount of time, resources for a particular reason. That your journey, your life is not random, but God has got you to where you are today for a purpose. And your skill, your time, your resources, your prayer matter. And what can you use from your position that you're in to be part of what God is doing? I think three crucial questions that are 2,500 years old and yet resonate just as much today in our context. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Wow, what a response from Queen Esther. What a huge response. Firstly, she realizes she's in and out of her depth. Wow, that's true for all of us. And her response is to fast and pray. I can't do this on my own. I need God's help. And so she stretches out and says, for 3 days to her friends, the people around her, will you fast and pray with me? Will you seek God with me? We're in and out of our depths. We need God's help. We can't do this on our own. And she puts it all there for prayer and for fasting. And secondly, she says, when this is done, when the prayer foundation has been laid, I will go. She accepts the challenge. She takes up the invitation. She hears God's call to her and responds, I will go. I will go and do what it is you're asking me to do. I'm prepared to be part of this, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. The queen before her went to the king's palace uninvited and was sent to exile for the rest of her life. The rules said, the law said, if you come to the king's palace uninvited, you can be killed. It was a genuine risk. And she knew there was a possibility or a probability that she could die for this. It's not fatalistic, but it's not naive either. And she took that on. How do we respond like Esther's? Not in our own strength, but the strength that comes through prayer and fasting and asking others to pray for us. And is willing to say, yes, I will go. I will do what I'm being asked, even though I'm fully cognizant of the risks, the potential risks in front of me. Next week, one of our couples heads back to South Asia, very aware of the risks in front of them. Lorraine prayed for many people who are involved in different parts of the world and their families. You prayed about grandparents and one wee young baby's life. And I met one of those grandparents on Friday. And that's a very real family risk. But they've gone because they believe God's called them. And grandparents are very, very supportive, though understandably anxious. What's our response in the midst of this? And then, I don't want to steal too much from next week, but basically, this is the painting of Queen Esther, the king, and the prime minister. And the prime minister and the queen have this meal. And the backstory is, if I've got time for a quick backstory, is one time there was a chance where the king was going to be killed. There was a plot to kill the king, and Mordecai heard about the plot, and he got the officials to find out about it, and the plot was stopped. Well, the night before this dinner, the king couldn't sleep, so he got one of his attendants to come and read to him from the Chronicles of the Kingdom. And he read, by chance, the piece where his life was in threat and Mordecai had saved his life. And the king looked at the reader and he said, has anybody ever thanked Mordecai for saving my life? And they flicked through the pages and said, oh, no, no one thought of doing that. And just at that moment, who would enter into the midst of the meeting but Heyman? And Heyman, well, you have to hear the rest of the story next week. But anyway, Heyman and the king and the queen have this meal. And at the middle of the meal, the king says to Queen Esther, who is it who sent that edict out to have all the Jews killed? And she points to the prime minister and says, it's him. And the king is furious and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to respond. And so he goes out to the garden for a moment. And Mordecai, who has set up a pole in his garden to have, Heyman, who set up a pole in his garden to have Mordecai impaled on it, 22 stories high, by the way, a really tall pole. We want to make a big deal of it. He throws himself at the queen and begs for mercy. He's worried. He's anxious. His life is at risk. And at that moment, the king comes back into the palace and sees that Heyman has thrown himself and his wife and thinks, this guy wants not just my kingdom, but my wife as well. And he doesn't know what to do. And a servant comes in right at that moment and he says, hey, by the way, Heyman's had a pole put up in his backyard, 22.5 meters high, to have Mordecai killed on. And the king says, have him killed on it. It's where Shakespeare gets that wonderful line, hoist on his own petard. That's the end for Heyman. But it's the beginning of a change in the king. He sends out an edict, a second edict, right across the empire that says the Jews have the right to stand up for themselves on the day they're going to be attacked. And the Jews defend themselves. And for 2,500 years, they have been celebrating Purim, that God rescued them when a people tried to destroy them and were going to wipe them out. Now, what does that say about us today? Very briefly, a couple of things about NZBMS and our future. Firstly, we're in a world that's under enormous change as well. Change starts with the letter C, and Kelly always has me on that I'm a typical preacher who likes to run things with C's. So here's 3 big C's that are bringing change in our world. COVID, yes. Climate change, absolutely. Culture change. The reality is that a new group of people are finding their voice. People who were marginalized over many decades are finding their voice and exerting their influence in new ways. To a world that is hungry for fresh voices and is sick of the voices from the center and is open to people who are bringing different answers and different suggestions. And so there is a new group of influences in the world that will change our culture rapidly. In this situation, we have realized we have to change too. And so we're setting about, and we would have been talking about it at Hui, a change process that looks a little bit like this and is based on Acts chapter 1, verse 8. At the bottom here, I have to move this, sorry. I have to go to this end to move it. Move. Why does that screen thing not want to move? Okay, at the bottom there it says gospel renewal, and that green line you can see a little bit. As Baptist churches, Charles has been encouraging us to be a part of gospel renewal. And the first thing we realize that we need to do is we need to listen and learn. As an NZBMS and mission workers, we need to listen and learn to what God's doing in the world, to be aware of how mission is changing, and it's changing fast. It's changing because these marginalized voices are taking influence and leading with control and power. We need to learn about governance and leadership. You may have seen the free set review of our governance. We need to change the ways we operate. We need to learn from Māori and biculturalism and Māori tikanga. That's our backroom stuff. The second thing we are going to look to do, this is our, if you like, our Jerusalem. If we want to encourage the 240 Baptist churches around New Zealand to grow in having a gospel heart, a heart for the gospel in their locality where they are gospel here, but also gospel globally. That God is still redeeming and renewing, and how to be part of that in really tangible, practical, and relational ways globally. The third thing we realize we need to do, and this might be our Judea, is to realize that we need to reconnect with mission with Māori. It's nearly over 100 years since we were involved hands-on with mission with Māori. And we want to redo that by being led by Māori, for mission for Māori by Māori, but supported by NZBMS. We realize that the Pacific is our neighborhood, our Samaria, and we need to be involved with the Pacific and those who are our brothers and sisters close by geographically. And the crucial issue which is confronting them, particularly in smaller communities, is climate change. How can we be part of that and helping to mitigate that in communities that are nearby? And lastly, carrying on our commitments in Asia for church growth and evangelism, for discipleship and training, for education and healthcare and business. That's where we think we're going. It's about Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, but also like the book of Acts, realizing, I want to go back one there, apologies, realizing that there has to be, this is about mutual gospel renewal. That what we learn in our churches, we need to pass into our Māori mission, and our Māori mission back to our churches. What we learn in the Pacific, we need to bring back to our churches, that it's mutual. The church in the West is in big trouble, and the place that we'll learn to find our pathway forward is the third world, not the American world, and learning mutually about what God is doing and how God's doing it. Last slide, I promise. And that is, it's going backwards now. Go forwards. Last slide. It's based on 4 values. I think they're values that reflect Mordecai, a gospel renewal, trusting that God is renewing the world and bringing his gospel work into the lives of everyone, and that we can be part of that. Mutual humility. One of the things that Mordecai shows throughout his life that's described in Esther is he's a man of humility. He's humble and he's willing to listen to God and be involved in what God is doing. And being holistic, being concerned about climate change, but also growing churches, being concerned about discipleship, but also developing businesses, being concerned about healthcare and education, being concerned about all of the ways that God's renewal is coming into the world and coming into communities and people's lives. And lastly, whakarongo, to listen, to really listen, to listen to the Spirit, to listen to each other, to have an openness and a humility to learn from each other, and a willingness, if you like, to put on sackcloth and ashes and cry out for the needs of the world and beg someone we know, an Esther in the world, a family member, hey, will you be part of God's renewal and what God is doing? That's what we're about. And I think you can link all of this back to such a crucial passage and realize it ends in celebration. And while we're going through a really difficult space, God's celebration is something we can rely on. Thank you.